Good afternoon, business students. So I was reading this article today in today's Times, and it turns out that Apple are now the number 2 smartphone manufacturer measured by volume of sales. So Samsung are number 1. Samsung in the first quarter of this year, I'm sure you can divide 12 months by a quarter to work out how many months that is, are now at 20.8%, and Apple are below that, 17 point something percent. So quite a big difference there. Now, quite a lot of it, according to the article, is because of protectionist policies where the Chinese government has restricted sales of Apple phones. China is the largest smartphone market on the planet. Now, you could argue this is tit for tat trade restrictions, because the Americans are just as guilty as the Chinese in doing this sort of thing. Or it could just be that actually China are purposefully positioning their own domestic brands like Xiaomi and things like that. So we're going to look at a quick calculate question. We're going to calculate the total size of the mobile phone market using market share information, and we're going to do an 8-marker on protectionism. I'm not going to talk through all of protectionism. I'm going to give you the definition. We're going to talk about it in context. There are different areas of protectionist policy that you should have revised, but this is an interesting article to record and share with you before I go home. So here is a very cut down version of the article. So go to the Times and read the full article. This is probably less than a third of it, but we've got enough information in here to answer this question. So using the data in the extract, there's only one, calculate the total amount of smartphones sold globally for the first quarter of 2024. So we need to go in and we need to look for information about smartphones and volumes and percentages. Okay, now this case study could be quite misleading for those that can't be bothered to read the entire case study. So if we look here, when we go, so we've got nearly 10%, giving us a bit of a clue, but we don't know what it started off with. Samsung delivered more than 60 million devices, okay, in the first quarter to capture 20.8. Now, first thing is, warning, more than, well, how much more than? I don't know. So I haven't got an accurate amount of data here in some ways to actually work with. So more than 60 million, yes, we know it's worth that as a percentage. I need something a bit more accurate. So I'm going to carry on reading. Here we can see Apple delivered 50.1 million units, I presume units are smartphones, accounting for 17.3%. So we know that we've got 50.1 million. This, in some ways, I'm questioning the reliability of this, well, validity in some ways. I'm sure it is relatively reliable, but it's not precise enough, so maybe it's not valid for me to be able to calculate my total market size measured by units or smartphones. So we know that Apple is 50.1 million units. We know that it's 17.3%. Now you will notice already that I've left the word or. That's to remind me to say, I'm going to show you 2 different ways of calculating this. Whichever way you do it, by the way, as long as you get the right answer, stick to that. Especially for the upper sixth, it's a bit late to change the way you calculate. And with most things in maths, you can calculate it in a number of different ways. These are just 2 different ways. You choose one that you're happy with, or just use the one that you already have, as long as you're coming out with the same answer. So we could find 1%. This is the easiest way for those that are less confident with maths to do it, I suppose, is we know that's 17.3%. I know that I've got that number. I've not put millions in there for now because I don't want to put all those zeros in my calculator and confuse my calculator. So I'm going to divide 50.1 by 17.3 to find 1%. 1% is that. Okay, I'm going to keep it round to 3 decimal places. I'm not going to round it to 2 because we don't round in the middle of a calculation. I'm sure you were taught that at prep school, if not in your GCSEs. So We're going to take that number, we're then going to times it by 100 to find 100%, and we've got to remember our M, because this is part of our unit descriptors, and if I forget to put that on the end of it, I'm nearly selling 290 somethings. So we've got millions of units. It says units over there. We'd probably get away with that. You could put smartphones. Okay, just remember to put the millions on the back of it if you're not putting all those zeros in your calculator. Or we could do it this way. So we want to just basically that divided by 100, which comes out at that number, and then just a slightly different way. Whichever way you are comfortable with, as long as it comes out with that answer, then you will be fine. Hopefully that was useful. But what a lovely case study. Then when we're thinking about this from a protectionist perspective, so I wrote this question for you and I wanted to get protectionism into it. So I've given it a little bit of an intro sentence. So some might classify Beijing's tightening restrictions as a protectionist policy. Clearly, we're going to have to make sure we're demonstrating an understanding of that. I didn't want you to interpret tightened restrictions. So some people might just define tightened restrictions and not directly answer the question. So we want it to be absolutely obvious that this is about protectionism. So it's in an intro sentence in some ways, which is why you've got to make sure you always read the text before and after a question. Assess the likely advantages. So we know that this is going to be basically a P paragraph. Well, this is where we still need to buy that special pen, isn't it? So we need basically a P, however, times 2. Okay, so P, one advantage is, however, there might be a disadvantage. And then another advantage is, so we've covered the 2 because it's advantages and an S on the end of it means more than one. Okay, of the Chinese tightened restrictions on the use of Apple products. Okay, so likely advantages to Samsung of the tightening of restrictions on Apple products. Okay, so we know that it's going to be advantages to Samsung. Okay, that's the hook. So we're going to start off with a definition. This is very textbooky. I've not bothered defining this in context actually. I just wanted to get something down that demonstrates I sort of understand protectionism. It's a government policy to basically protect domestic industries from foreign competition. We know that. That just helps us to structure our answer. But if you start off with a definition, at least you're answering the question. So one advantage, you'll see I've put that because that's in the question, of Beijing's tightened restrictions on Apple products could give Samsung an advantage in China as Korean smartphone sales are not restricted. So this is application because it's Korean smartphone sales. This is not application because that is in the question. You can't just repeat this and expect to get your application marks, but we've got some application. Then we're looking, in some ways we've already got a chain of argument there. I've emboldened the others. There's a number of them here. If you contextualise, like I've said before, it's really easy to get 3 chains of argument. By imposing limitations on the use of Apple products, the Chinese government indirectly supports domestic and other foreign competitors by restricting the market access of the previous market leader. That's actually more application because that's to do with Apple clearly. This might be one reason that Samsung now has a 20.8% global market share. So the question is likely advantages to Samsung, and directly they're restricting the sale of Apple, which means they've increased their market share. Easy. However, these advantages might be short-lived. Yeah, they've only just become the market leader this quarter. Okay, this is not the end of Apple. I'm sure Apple will come up with another strategy, and if it's not in China, then it might be in other markets. We'll see what happens. But they're not going to sit back and go, okay, you've got us, we're going to give up. So these advantages might be short-lived if consumers retained brand loyalty to Apple, or if the restrictions are lifted, potentially restoring Apple's market position. So if the Americans and the Chinese suddenly start getting on again, then maybe Apple sales will take off for those people that really want Apple in China and the rest of the world. The Chinese restrictions on Apple could result in increased sales and market share for Samsung in the world's largest smartphone market. That's application, because we're referring to China. With Apple's ability to compete being restricted, back to the definition really, but sort of a chain of argument, Samsung might see increased demand for its phones, not its products, its phones. A little bit more context. The article states that Samsung delivered more than 60 million devices in the first quarter of the year to capture 20.8% global market share. A bit of a lazy quote there, but actually it's a chain of argument in itself. And yes, it is the same, but it's a bit different because it's got 60 million devices in it. You could have just ended it there and not put the rest of this in there and still got that analysis impact in context with likely advantages to Samsung. So that's a bit waffly, that one. However, Samsung's gain in market share might be impacted by the rise of other competitors, especially from local Chinese manufacturers like Xiaomi. Okay, so in the case study, it talks about a number of domestic brands, and we've gone back to the definition, which is shields domestic industries from foreign competitors. Yes, it's about Samsung, but one of the counter arguments could be the rise of those domestic brands. Okay, so here's the question. Obviously, the only thing we're worried about is it's not that is it perfect, is it? It's to do with, is it level 3? And that's because there's only 3 levels in the 8 markers, as we know. So we don't want any of this. Now remember, if you can get full marks in your 8 markers, and they are relatively quick and easy to write, and this is quite an easy question, let's face it, you should be able to get full marks on this, but you've only got 10 minutes to write it. Don't over answer it, because you'll just run out of time on the harder 12 and 20s. So, is it accurate throughout? Is it contextualized throughout? Does it talk about business behavior? Well, the answer is definitely yes. Are there a minimum of 3 chains of argument? The 8s and the 10s do not need 5 chains of argument generally. They need to have these logical chains of reasoning. They don't need these extended ones, these wide-ranging arguments. Wide-ranging is the term in the 12 marks standards, for example. So are there a minimum of 3 in each of these arguments? Well, yeah, and that's if you don't even count the ones that are in the howevers. So we're probably up to 5 in each of these anyway. So is it balanced? Well, I've remembered the howevers. Yeah, so yes, it's balanced. Now also, these howevers are in context. This is a really important thing, and a common mistake for A-level students is they write a however that's just totally abstract, and then they don't get the marks for the however. Remember, if you don't get the marks for one counter-argument, possibly if everything else is perfect, you're going to get 7 out of 8. If both of them are missing, both howevers are missing, you just do one advantage, another advantage, which is what some people will do this summer because they'll just answer the question and not remember the standards, then you're going to get maximum of 4 marks. Okay? I'm sure there'll be lots of people this summer that will get their answers capped at 4 out of 8 because they don't bother to write any howevers. Is it balanced? Is it well contextualized? Is it using the data? Well, it doesn't need to calculate in this case. And in some ways, we've missed a trick here, remember, because in a previous slide, you would have seen a calculation. But remember, this 8 marker, if it's paper 3, which is the only place you'll find 8 markers, there's not a question before it. If this was a 10 marker in paper 1, then I should have remembered the maths from the 4 marker that I've just done. I could bring in the total amount of volumes of handset sales. Yeah, if this trend continues, I could have times that by 4 to work out the average annual smartphone sales. across the globe. So remember the earlier questions, you might be able to use them, but not so much with 8 markers, obviously. And shows an awareness of competing arguments. We know we're going to cross that out because the chief examiner does, and you do not write conclusions for 8 markers. You do for 10, 12s and 20s. So looking at obviously best practice from reading the examiner reports, because that's what you should all be doing if you're upper 6 students preparing, and lower 6 students, you should be reading these things anyway. This is how teachers learn how to teach the standards. So better responses to the question have a well-structured opening demonstrating an understanding. This says staff training, obviously, which is from a previous past paper, not this question. And look up here. We're opening the question, my answer up with a well-structured definition. Then, when presenting 2 lines of argument, always provide a balance for each. And here we have 1 and 2. No overall judgment is necessary, so we don't need a conclusion down here, as I've put a line through this. The Chief Examiner report, this is from 2022, I believe, it reminds us we do not need a conclusion. Okay, hopefully that was useful. Why don't you try and answer the question? And if you don't want to rewrite the 8 marker, why don't you turn this one into a 12 marker? All you need to do is take my answer, write a conclusion, justify your answer, considering the alternative maybe, and then think about one of those future orientated mops. Then, instead of the 8 mark standards, why don't you use the 12 mark standards that you can just download free of charge from Edexcel's website? Hopefully that was useful.